Hi, I'm Finbar, aka Steelfur, host of Steelfur Speaks, and this is my new player hero guide. This video is going to give a quick breakdown of every single hero in the game, how they play, how they feel on the table, and all of that is going to come together to give any new player watching this an idea of which hero might be for you, which is going to be more accessible, and which you should pick up as you begin your journey in the world of Wraith. Dorinthea Ironsong is the first hero we're going to look at. She is a warrior hero released in the first set of Flesh and Blood. Dorinthea is a hero focused on attacking multiple times with a weapon per turn. Her iconic weapon, Dawnblade, gets counters if it hits more than once a turn, and her effect lets her attack with a weapon a second time as long as she is hit with that weapon once. Dawnblade is the iconic weapon, but there are other weapons available. The standard turn for warrior looks like finding a way to give your weapon go again, a way to buff it to hit it for more, a way to add some on-hit effects, and generally it's weapon-focused combat. Choose Dorinthea as your hero if you want to embody that classic fighter archetype where you're trying to attack with a single weapon multiple times a turn. Additionally, she does have some tricks and some combat tricks she can play, ways of buffing her weapon, and some mind games that she can play. So if you are attracted to that idea of a person attacking with a sword and keeping a whole handful of cards and then tricking their opponent with buffs, she also might be a good choice for you. Moving on then to our evaluation, on core mechanics, Dorinthea gets a 4 stars. She is very focused on attacking with your weapons, she is very focused on the attack reaction phase, and even has defense reactions as well. She has go again, but not emphasis on complex turns. She really touches all the mechanics of the game, which is really good for new players, which is why we give her 4 stars. Dorinthea is also a very accessible hero. She has very good emphasis on attacking and blocking, which makes her easy to pick up. She also has a lot of armor, which makes her quite forgiving because there are hit effects that you can block well with the armor that she has available. Her turn patterns are often also easy to see. You play your go again, you play your attack reaction, and then depending on your resources, maybe you play a second one. So it's very easy to find spare cards to block with, which is a place where new players struggle a lot in the early part of the game. However, that focus on core mechanics and her good accessibility does see some detriment to the depth score. Her reaction speed play can be complex, but it is something that your opponents will learn and will know how to play around, especially if they play defense reactions. And if they can stop your first weapon attack from hitting, you will find yourself struggling to extend the turns you're playing. That being said, they are adding a wide variety of weapon options, some of which may create some potential for diverse deck building in the future, and she also enables people to pivot into the other warrior heroes, both Katsu in Blitz and Boltyn in CC, which use both some of her core power cards that you would have invested in, but also use some of her core legendaries that you will have invested in as well. So despite a low depth score, the fact that she plays so well with the core mechanics of the game means she's a great hero to learn. Her accessibility in terms of how easy it is to see the good plays and the amount of armor she has and how that plays into learning how to block well makes her a really great hero for new players. Also, it's worth noting that her cards are generally easy enough to get. She's been around in the game for a while. Her cards have been reprinted in both WTR Unlimited and in the History Pack sets, which means there are quite a lot of warrior cards to play with, as she is one of the older cards in the game. Next, we look at Sir Boltyn, Breaker of the Dawn, the second warrior that is legal and classic constructed. Boltyn is a light warrior, which means mechanically he differs from Dorinthea and has more aspects to him, as he has to play around the core light mechanic of soul. Boltyn typically charges his soul and then can spend cards to fuel effects. Charging your soul is a simple mechanical effect where you play a card that lets you banish a card from your hand to a special zone, and then you can spend cards in that zone to trigger effects. The most straightforward of these effects is on Boltyn's own ability, where he has an attack reaction that lets you banish a card from soul to give target attack with power greater than its base go again. However, there are ways to spend soul. He also has the weapon Raiden that costs 0 to attack, and if you have charged, has +3. He also often plays with Centauri Sabers, which is another weapon that he attacks with multiple times in one turn. Boltyn is a slower form of warrior. The charge mechanic means that to attack and charge his soul, he's required to keep a minimum of 2 cards in hand. That means that his resource efficiency can be a bit more complicated. It also means he lends himself to larger combo turns, where he has charged a lot of cards into his soul, and that he uses those cards to have bigger returns with more threats. So play Boltyn if you're looking for a more defensive, considered style of warrior, where you're going to have bigger payoff turns, where you spend the resources you've been accumulating during the game to play a bit more aggressively that turn. Boltyn he's interesting because he interacts with the core mechanics of the game as much as Dorinthea does, in terms of weapon attacks, focusing on buffs, but he has other layers to him. So he has to charge, which basically is banishing a card from your soul to turn on a lot of abilities. And he also has the ability to generate big combo turns using cards like Luminar Ascension. That adds kind of a layer of complexity to him that makes his interaction with the core mechanics a bit less than we'd see in Dorinthea. He's still very focused on weapon attacks, getting that go again, but he kind of falls off because you have to give one of your cards every turn to get that go again, which is to get not just go again, but other buffs, which is a bit of friction for new players that I don't like as much. His power turns do come from combo, which require a bit of awareness of the tempo and pace of the game, as well as set up to get those combo turns to come through, which I think reduces his accessibility again. So I've given him 2, which is quite a low score, but I think the barriers to entry here in terms of additional complexity, especially compared to other heroes like, say, Dorinthea, mean that he's a bit less accessible compared to them. However, that accessibility barrier is countered by his depth score, which is much higher. So new players who invest the time to learn the focus, the combo, the alternative resource costs will find there is payoff there. There are really satisfying big turns that pay off in these combos, and there are alternative strategies to win. And he also brings a lot of blocking capabilities throughout the game. You might end up blocking quite a lot and just charging one card for a lot of the turns of the game, but that teaches you how to efficiently block, and then that pays off in these power combo turns later on. We've also seen people taking the ability to fatigue decks, blocking their reds, and then coming in with your power turns later on, which gives him a bit more depth and a bit more options. However, depth is not the strongest factor when considering new player heroes. Where they can get to if they invest time is not really the best thing in terms we want a hero that is good to play, has fun mechanics, and is very accessible. And because of that, we're going to give Sir Boltyn a 2 out of 5 on this ranking. I know some fans are going to think that's low, but I feel like there are obstacles here that make him less fun from a new player perspective. Players who want that go again, lots of attacks, combo playstyle with a bit more power should look to maybe play Katsu in Blitz, which does embody that, but goes off a lot more aggressively, a lot faster, and the lines seem to be a lot clearer. But in CC, Boltyn is the only option for that regard if you want to play Warrior, and unfortunately he doesn't meet our criteria as a good new player hero. Katsu the Wanderer is a ninja hero released in the first set of Flesh and Blood WTR, and a personal favourite of mine. Katsu is a ninja, and ninjas focus on lots of attacks and go-wide strategies. Katsu's hero ability reads, once per turn effect, when your attack action hits, you may discard a card from your cost 0 from your hand. If you do, search your deck for an attack action card with combo, banish it face up, and you may play it this turn. Combo is a keyword that rewards you for sequencing attacks, so if you play 1-2 punch, for example, after a head jab, the 1-2 punch has an additional ability. This effect lets you search your deck for a card with combo when you hit with a card that would trigger it, and allows you to sequence very effective turns where you're playing attack actions in the right order to get a lot of bonuses, which kind of emphasizes that 1-2 punch martial arts focused style of combat. Katsu also uses his weapon a lot. The Harmonized Kodachi gets Go Again when you pitch a card that costs 0, which also synergizes with his hero ability. This ability to attack for 1 twice a turn, just for 1 pitch, is a really good pressure game for late game, and also really good for setting up turns where cards expect you to hit more than once in a row to trigger effects. Play Ninja if you want to be rewarded for these good sequencing turns and to feel like you're doing that 1-2 punch, that combo style thing that you would see in Hong Kong cinema or in those classic Kung Fu films. It really does pay that off in the mechanics. He also has a bit of a samurai feel in terms of his art, which resonates with a lot of people. Mechanically, Katsu focuses on Go Again on his attacks, the combo keyword and the sequencing those combo attacks, attacking with his weapons, and going wide beyond his opponent's ability to block. Really, Katsu covers every single core mechanic in the game. He likes to focus on his weapons, he has some good attack reactions, he likes to focus on attack actions, and he has some really great defense reactions as well. Katsu is this well-rounded hero when it comes to interaction with core mechanics in the game, and anyone learning to play the game can learn through the lens of Ninja and do everything the game has to offer, which is one of the reasons why early FAB's initial learn-to-play decks were Ira, a blitz-only ninja. However, accessibility is where Katsu really starts to fall down. His turns have to be very structured because you have to layer combo turns one after another. His core hero ability requires searching the deck, which isn't necessarily something you can do very easily unless you're good at memorizing all the cards in your deck, which is not something you should expect from new players. And he's also very susceptible to disruption because if you take a key combo piece out of his hand or you attack him in a way that disrupts his ability to attack when he's set up a long turn, then he really gets punished for not delivering on the payoff that he's been working to set up during the game. Katsu is really good though for older, more experienced TCG players who are looking for a challenge and looking for a sequencing hero that pays off when you get things lining up. Lack of accessibility once again pays off in depth. Katsu really rewards deck knowledge, both in terms of what you can search for before you trigger your ability, but also the knowledge of what's left in your deck that you can still set up for late game, and the knowledge of how to sequence properly and what kind of the upward limits of your deck are in terms of damage, so you can take damage knowing that you can deal more in return. He also has really good late-game defensive strategies if he wants to switch into those. Most Katsu decks are more aggressive, but they do have tools available for more defensive, weapon-focused attack, where their opponent is on 1 life, and every time they swing a weapon, they take a card from their hand, which can help you fatigue the enemy. All that being said, despite the really good interaction with the core game mechanics, accessibility really brings Katsu's score down. The fact that you need to have this deck knowledge and this sequencing and you're so susceptible to disruption and not playing your turn correctly really leaves him at a 3-star score. However, I will say that for the more experienced TCG player who's already very familiar with these concepts and is really looking for a challenge and a hero that's going to reward playing, that's where Katsu really does pay off. So consider him if that sort of fits you and if you really want that ninja 1-2 punch style gameplay. Our next hero is Phi Rising Rebellion, a draconic ninja from the Uprising set of Flesh and Blood. While Katsu is the 1-2 punch combo style of ninja, Phi is the aggressive flurry of blows monk punch style of ninja. He really focuses on putting as many attacks on the board as possible, sequencing these huge turns with attacks that aren't interesting in themselves, but when they all get combined together, can do an overwhelming amount of damage and harness his draconic fury to burn his opponents to a crisp. Phi's hero ability is fairly straightforward. At the start of the game, he can search his deck for a Phoenix Flame and put it in his graveyard. As a once per turn instant effect, he can spend 3 to return that Phoenix Flame from his graveyard to his hand, and that ability costs 1 less for each Draconic Chainlink you control. For newer players, Draconic Chainlink refers to a talented type of card. It's considered a draconic chain link if it is a draconic attack. So draconic weapon, draconic attack action, or something else turns it into a draconic attack. So every time you have one of those chain links doing an attack, that's a draconic chain link, which reduces the cost of fire. So if you've attacked 3 times with draconic cards, Phoenix Flame is free. Phoenix Flame itself is a 0 cost, 0 power attack, which gets +1 if you control 2 or more draconic chain links and has go again. Fire's signature weapon is the Searing Ember Blade, which costs 2 to attack for 3. If you control 2 or more draconic chain links, Searing Ember Blade has go again. The Fi does also have a lot of decks that use the Kodachis we saw in the Katsu video, which is a pitch a 0 cost blue, a 0 cost card to attack for 1 with go again. Fi centers around building these long turns of draconic chain links. As I said in the intro, he is about go again, go again, go again. Some of his effects don't really trigger until you have 4+ chain links or 3+ chain links when he starts to get these buffs. And really his playstyle is about breaking through your opponent, doing more damage than they can block in a turn, and going over the top with more power. If you feel like you want to burn hot, burn fast, play that red deck wins, I'm aggro, yes, if you disrupt me I lose, but if you don't, I'm just going to do more damage than you could ever do, then Fi might be the hero for you. Although he does have to block as much as any other hero to stop on hits, Fi really is focused around 3 simple things: going out on his attacks, attacking with weapons when it makes sense, and going as wide as possible. Because of that, his interaction with the core mechanics of the game is lower than we've seen in other heroes. He has access to defense reactions, but they're not a key part of his core fantasy. He brings them in when he needs to. Really, he is focused around attacking, sequencing, and that kind of gives him a lower score than someone like Dorinthea, who has more attack reactions, or someone like, you know, Katsu, who is always playing with the next step and the next thing and moving around his deck and sorting things. Fi is a very straightforward hero, and that's reflected in his mechanics score. However, that doesn't really lend itself to accessibility in the way you think it might need to. Yes, attacking is easy, and attacking with a full hand is easy, but you're rarely going to be able to keep that full hand, and learning to play around disruption makes him quite a difficult hero because his attacks attack for a lot, but they don't block very well, which makes him quite difficult. Also, a lot of his cards require draconic chain links in order to work, and sometimes that can mean that the sequencing of his turns can be quite difficult to get maximum effect, which makes it hard to really reap the benefits. So a new player will find it easy to pick up Fi, and when his opponent lets him keep a full hand, he'll be able to go, deal tons of damage. But they will find there are points of friction where they realize they've walked themselves into a corner, they can't do the number of attacks they want to, and there's just friction there. Phoenix Flame also I've seen as quite disruptive for new players. Much like new players often forget to get an item out of their deck for dash, a lot of new players, and myself occasionally, forget to take the Phoenix Flame out of their deck at the start of the game, or they present a 61 card deck because they take the Phoenix Flame out first, and then they count 59 cards and think, oh, I need another one, when actually Phoenix Flame counts as that one card. So it's a small thing, but that Phoenix Flame disrupts setup in a way that is tricky for new players, and that kind of reduces his accessibility a bit. In terms of depth, sometimes Fi is just go, so he doesn't have a lot of depth score. He is focused on more attacking. His key question is, can I do more damage than you? And that means that he hasn't got a lot of depth in that regard. However, the depth comes in the areas that he struggles. Blocking for him is a very difficult thing because a lot of his cards block for 2 or are very inefficient on blocking compared to how efficient they are at attacking. And that means the depth does come in working out how to block efficiently and counterattack with more damage than your opponent and win that damage exchange every time by being on the more aggressive side of it. That lends itself to a surprising depth, a lot of players don't necessarily acknowledge, but if you look at the really good FI players, they're not just always attacking constantly. There's a layering of blocking, there's a decision matrix going in there, and the people who really succeed with FI will master that. So he still gets a low depth score because his ideal game plan is just go, 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 I do more damage than you. But he does have a few stars gained from the complexity that displays itself when you can't play that go, go, go game. That leads to FI only getting a 3 out of 5 stars in terms of new player score. I feel like this might surprise any of your friends that play the game in more depth, because FI is that aggressive, red deck win, straightforward aggro hero, but I feel like Flesh and Blood has evolved beyond that as a game, and there's a lot of disruption, there's a lot of sequencing, there's a lot of need to block, which means that FI is something that new players will really enjoy when it's going well, and feel really, really bad when it's going badly. Nothing feels worse than as a FI player against the wall where you're being forced to block, and your cards just don't do it that well. You can't attack as much as you want to, you're not getting those explosive turns, and I think that can be quite frustrating, which is why I think he gets this score. Bravo is our next hero, the Guardian released in Welcome to Wraith, and the only Guardian still legal in Classic Constructed. Bravo and Guardian in general bring a control, defensive, blocking style gameplay empowered by aura magic. Expect setup, expect defensive style gameplay, expect to swing your weapon a lot without doing anything fancy with it because you blocked with most of your hand. But if you like to feel in control of the game, if you like to feel like you can disrupt your opponent and tailor your control to the opponent that you're facing, Bravo might be the hero for you. Bravo's hero ability reads, spend 2 as an action. Until the end of the turn, your attack action cards with cost 3 or greater gain Dominate. Go again. Bravo does not typically trigger this on more than 1 attack on a turn. Typically he gives 1 attack Dominate, and that is the focus of his hero ability. His weapon, Anathos, says once per turn action, 3 cost attack. If you have 2 or more cards in your pitch zone with cost 3 or greater, Anathos gets +2. A typical turn for Bravo is pitching a card for some of their effect, either to generate a discount for the next turn or to play an aura, and then attacking with Anathos with the other blue card, and attacking for 6, which your opponent obviously has to block because he can only take so many 6 attack swings during the game before he loses. Bravo will typically block with 2 of the cards in his hand, use the other 1 or 2 cards to attack with his hammer, and that's a pretty solid play pattern for the entire game, though it is punctuated with very large attack actions, which he occasionally uses hero ability to go and give Dominate. Mechanically then, Bravo blocks a lot, he goes tall, which is playing 1 big attack rather than a lot of little attacks like we saw with Ninja. He has this effect called Crush, where a lot of his attack actions will disrupt the opponent if they do 4 or more damage. So I might attack you for 9, and if you take 4 or more damage from that attack, then your attacks next turn can't get go again, as one example. These disruption effects, plus the fact that he can mix in setup that gives them buffs and basically control the speed of the game, means that Bravo really is interacting with all the core mechanics of the game. He has a lot of defense reactions, he attacks on his own speed, he uses attack actions, he blocks, he even has attack reactions and likes to use attack reactions like Pummel a lot. So if you like that big, I'm gonna smash you, but also staying in control of the game control style, then Bravo works very well on those core mechanics. Bravo is also a very accessible hero. If you're playing slowly, you're already swinging your weapon and doing one other thing a turn, it's very easy to plan your turns out, which means it's very easy to block. And that creates space for new players to play at their own speed, to figure out the best blocks and then do small things in return. And that creates really good accessibility at a hero level. Now, playing at your own speed isn't slow playing, and Bravo does sometimes get accused of playing too slowly because he's just attacking with his weapon. But really there is that area in Flesh and Blood for heroes that play slow, choose their moments, and Bravo is one of those. Also on Disruption, Disruption is fun to play as a new player. You're putting these huge attacks on the board and then your opponent has to think about them a lot. All you really have to think about is whether it's worth taking damage to do the Disruption effect. Your opponent has to spend a lot longer thinking whether they're going to block it or take the effect. So that's quite interesting for a new player, but also very accessible because you're just trying to think which attack should I play next. Despite both his strength of core mechanics and his accessibility, Bravo actually comes with a lot of depth. His card pool has a lot of silver bullets, and for new card game players that means cards that target a specific strategy or gameplay style. That means that depending on the meta, the group of decks that are winning, you can choose and tailor your deck to target those. And that's why Bravo is always relevant in the meta and always finding new ways to be relevant in the meta. Also, he has a lot of depth in his core attacking and blocking play patterns. You know, do I take a little bit of damage here to do this attack, or do I just block everything out? He has those options in ways other heroes don't have. Finally, there's this pivot theory in Flesh and Blood, which is at what point does Bravo stop blocking as much and start focusing more on slinging these big attacks, using his hero ability for Dominate, and that point changes with every single hero he's paired up against. So if you're the sort of person who's looking for this control style gameplay with a lot of depth to improve and glow as you play the hero, Bravo is an excellent choice for that, and I fully recommend him to new players looking for that style of gameplay. And that's why he gets 5 stars out of 5 stars, one of the very few 5-star ratings we're going to give. His core mechanics are easy to understand, straightforward, and he plays along a lot of the different accesses of the game, involving non-attack actions, auras, using his weapon, using attack reactions, things like Dominate and stuff like that, as well as blocking very well. He's very accessible, he lets people play at their own speed, block very well, and control the flow of the game. And he has a large card pool with lots of depth. New players that sink their teeth into him will find themselves enjoying Bravo for a long time after they start the game. Also, Guardians have historically been very good, and they are one of LSS's original classes, and therefore there will likely always be a Guardian in the game, which means that he is a very good option for new players as well in that regard. Our next hero, Rhinar Reckless Rampage, is the first brute hero introduced in the game, being introduced in the WTR set, the first set. Brutes are a class much like Guardian that focus on a small number of big attacks and that slow gameplay style. Brute, however, has an edge of randomness that Guardian doesn't have. So whereas Guardian is slow, controlled setup, Brute is also set up, but he has this aspect of randomness, of dice rolling, of picking random cards from your opponent's hand. So if you're a gambler, Brute might be the class for you. Rhinar Reckless Rampage reads, when you discard a card with 6 or more power from your hand, Intimidate. Intimidate says target hero banishes a card face down at random from their hand. At the beginning of the end phase, they return all cards banished this way to their hand. That means that when you trigger Intimidate, either from Rhinar's ability or from one of his cards that has that keyword, you can strip cards from your opponent's hand until the end of the turn. That means they will not be available for them to block with. His weapon is quite straightforward, costs 2, attacks for 4. If you've discarded a card with 6 or more, it gets +1 until the end of turn. Typically, Rhinar uses his weapon when he needs to, but most of his focus is on doing big attacks that trigger a discard as an additional cost, and therefore cause an Intimidate and make it difficult for his opponent to block. Intimidate is a multi-layered ability because it does, when you trigger enough of it in one turn, prevent any blocking. If you Intimidate 4 times, your opponent cannot block from hand and can only block from arsenal or with armor. However, even intimidating one card can create disruption because you might intimidate the card that your opponent wanted to block with and leave them with only cards they don't want to block with. So that makes him quite an interesting hero in that regard. In terms of interaction with core mechanics, Rhinar is quite good. He has combo turns, so he does need to block a bit to reach those turns. He goes tall, he uses attack reactions sometimes. He has this intimidate keyword, which means he's always engaging with his opponent's hand, engaging with their blocking, which makes him quite an interesting hero to have in a play group. And also, you know, that setup and defensive style, which is kind of contrary to his art. I've always found it quite funny that his art is always about ripping, tearing, blood, aggression, rage, but actually he can only do that on specific turns when he's got certain things lining up. So his interaction with core mechanics, I think, is quite high. You know, he's one of those heroes who is always engaged in the basic functions of the game in a good way. Accessibility is where Rhinar starts to run into a bit of difficulty, in my opinion. A lot of his cards have additional costs, like say you must discard an additional card at random, and only really get their buff if you discard a card with 6 or more power. For example, discard a card at random. If you discard a 6 or more power card, you get go again. That means that sequencing on his turns and figuring out what cards you need to get in your hand can be a bit difficult. You can also just completely miss, which is quite a frustrating experience for new players. He also does have, which is rare, quite a few cards that do not block, and those are power cards. They do not have a block value, so you cannot block with them in any way, unlike someone like Fi, whose cards block badly, but they still block. That means that you can be left with hands where you're taking lots of damage or a disruption effect with no way of actually engaging with it, which makes him feel rather inaccessible. However, that being said, his combo turns do feel great, and the fact that you're rewarded for learning them and leaning heavily into them does raise his accessibility score. They are quite well telegraphed in terms of what you need to make them work. And in that regard, that means he is an easy hero to understand from at least a gameplay perspective, though for me, the drawbacks of his hero ability create enough friction that I wouldn't say he's super accessible. Rhinar does bring some depth to the table with his emphasis on setup, and he does focus on these big turns with these big payoffs where he sets up a lot of intimidate, his opponent can't block, and then he hits them for a ton of damage. That does pay off better in Blitz than it does in CC, and I will admit that this guide is kind of focused a lot into how they fare in both, so he does lose points for that. Also, he does just suffer from the fact in terms of there's only so much depth that you can have when luck also matters. His legendary boots say roll a dice. If it rolls and you get half of the result on the dice in action points when you see it. So if you get a 6, you get 3 action points. If you get a 1, you get 0. If you intimidate the wrong card from your opponent's hand, they might just not care. There's a lot of luck factors. You know, if you discard the wrong card as an additional cost, you don't get intimidate. You might also not get go again. And I feel like that luck impacts his depth quite heavily because you just can't control that. You can't learn your way through it. There are ways to minimize it, but you can't completely get rid of it. Some people love that, but it's not really a good depth score because there is some skill to it, but ultimately it's down to the luck. So, finally, his new player score, he only gets 3 stars out of 5. He's fairly straightforward to play. You attack with your weapon or you swing a big attack, you discard a card from hand, you intimidate. The setup makes him a bit difficult, but that could be rewarding in another hero. After all, we gave Bravo points for the very same thing, the fact that you had control and setup. When you start factoring in the fact that luck is such a factor and can backfire in a huge way, and he has to play these non-block cards that also can leave him exposed on a certain turn, that makes it hard for me to recommend Rhinar to new players who along all of these aspects, to be honest. That being said, a lot of people just really vibe with his art and his powerful gameplay and just really want to play Brute. So if that's striking you the right way, don't let me put you off. Brute is a powerful and a fun class, especially in Blitz, and that can be rewarded. But I think that for a general new player, I wouldn't recommend him as a first hero. Levia, the Shadow Brute, is much like Rhinar, a class that relies a little bit on randomness. Levia banishes cards from her graveyard in order to fuel powerful attacks, go again, and other effects. She also hurts herself if she doesn't banish cards from her graveyard that meet that 6 power requirement. But she does get that payoff for playing that aggressive style, running close to the edge, in terms of a lot of power, a lot of strength that comes through in these really big turns. And she also has some very unique mechanics, and currently the game's only demi-hero character. What is a demi-hero? Well, I'll explain in just a second. Levia's ability is quite straightforward. It just says, if a card with 6 or more power has been put into your banished zone this turn, you do not take damage from Blood Debt at the end of the turn. Blood Debt is a very simple ability. Basically, if a card with Blood Debt is in your banished zone, at the end of the turn, you lose 1 life. Levia turns that off, so her playstyle is very much playing cards that turn off the Blood Debt, but also getting those Blood Debt cards into her banished zone to fuel effects. The most common weapon that she ends up using is Mandible Claws. This is a 2 attack, 3 power weapon that says if you've discarded a 6 or more power card this turn, it gains go again. That enables her to do some very large combo turns where she discards a card and then attacks with this weapon while it's buffed. Then we also have the Demi Hero, which has way too much text for a new player to be interested in, but the summary of it really is that when she's taking all this damage from Blood Debt, she has a way to switch it off. She has a way to change into 2 different forms that have different effects on the end game and add a layer of complexity to her end game strategy. One of the problems with a hero that plays on a different axis, in this case banishing cards from her graveyard and managing Blood Debt, is that they don't really have space for caring for a lot of the other cool mechanics of the game. That means you don't find any attack reactions in Levia's stable, though she does sometimes bring generic ones in. You find that she's focused very heavily on those combo turns where she leverages Blood Debt, but most of her focus isn't on the game the same way that a Bravo or a Katsu would be. It's on managing Blood Debt, dealing as much damage to the opponent as possible, and trying to kill the opponent before she inevitably kills herself. Unfortunately, a lot of those same reasons that she gets a very low mechanics score carry over into accessibility. Her additional costs of banishing means you also have to factor in graveyard management, 6 power card management, card discard management so she can play the powerful cards from Brute. She's got the randomness from Brute as well. And then she's got this whole Blood Debt thing running over the back of this, which means that if she blocks with the wrong cards, she might end up taking a ton of damage from Blood Debt. If she blocks badly and then, say, her opponent makes her discard an extra card with a pummel or something, she might find herself killing herself to Blood Debt. Now, there are saves built into the game now in the form of the Demi Heroes, but that doesn't really make her more accessible for a new player. It really just adds another layer of complexity you have to learn in order to save her from her own mechanics. Levia does have some depth, and when you line things up with her, she is able to smash. She can have these really powerful turns with Art of War and Bloodrush Bellow that makes her quite fun to play. There's also a lot of depth in the learning to manage her weaknesses, learning how best to use demi-heroes, how best to mitigate Blood Debt, and what her power turns look like. She has depth. I would give her 4 stars. I think she has a lot of depth, and I know a lot of people are enjoying exploring that depth, and because she's recently just had a good expansion as of making this video, people haven't explored that depth fully. However, even with that high depth score, I cannot really countenance giving Levia anything more than a 1 star for new players. She's self-harming in terms of her abilities. They really just set her back massively. She has all these additional costs she has to play. She also has this layer of randomness that she gets from Brute, so if she rolls badly on her boots, she doesn't get a good turn. She has all these weaknesses, and okay, the payoff can be fun. She can deal a lot of damage, she can be quite powerful, but I feel like for a new player, she's not really the sort of hero you should be picking up. You should be picking up a hero that doesn't kill you when you mess up. Like, there are lots of other choices in the game that don't come with that handicap, and I would struggle to recommend new players to play Levia, unfortunately. So that is our new player hero guide, part 1, covering Brutes, Warriors, Ninjas, and Guardians. Part 2 will be coming up, covering Wizard, Ranger, and Runeblade. And then, of course, we'll have the final part that covers Assassin, Illusionist, and Mechanologist. So stay tuned for those. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you are a new player, the rest of these videos should be in the playlist under this. So just keep listening in order, and you'll have the rest of the classes. They're just split up for a bit of ease, as I had them in one big episode before, and people were having trouble getting to the hero they wanted. So I've split it up a bit more, and also FAB keeps adding new heroes, how inconsiderate of them. So I want to have this a bit more modular so I can add things over the time. So if you're a new player, just keep listening to the playlist, and you'll hear about the rest of the heroes in this game as we go through the playlist. Thank you very much, and bye.